In the farthest corner of the cell, he lay quietly on his bed. He wouldn't talk or engage with anyone. It had been 2 months since he arrived here, accused of murder, like the rest of us. The familiar guards claimed he wouldn't be able to get out. They didn't know the reason behind the murder. This situation both intrigued and instilled a bit of fear in the inmates. He didn't seem like someone who would commit murder. He had a well-structured face, resembling more of a teacher than a killer, with his bald head and glasses. His long, slender face seemed to hide something, with sunken eyes and even his beard turning white. Someone mentioned he was in his 40s. He was always seen with a book in hand, mostly about history. The origins of these books were unclear, as he rarely had visitors. When we went out to the yard, he would sit in a corner, gazing at the sky, as if his thoughts were too vast to contain, and he wanted to share them with the birds in the heavens. I had become one of the regulars here, having sent 3 people underground for a matter of honor. Yunnan gendarmes had caught him while trying to escape. I had been here for 5 years. There was still time left, but the days seemed endless. Even if time passed, what difference would it make? If I were released, I'd probably be back here within 3 days. Were the evils outside more prevalent, or was I exaggerating? This situation had created a sense of security for me inside. I earned respect from others. I was considered an elder brother. What I said went, and people sought me out for solutions to arising issues. I was comfortable, but at night, when I laid my head on the cold cell bed, questions would arise in my mind. Was there another life possible for me? Could things have turned out differently? Was it really worth taking the lives of those I took? Perhaps they weren't, but it had happened and the dead were already gone. There was no point in looking back, as there was no way to change what had happened. Days and nights passed with these thoughts. Until that afternoon, after finishing our meal on a relatively warm March day, they took us to the yard for fresh air. The yard, about 8 meters by 4 meters, was covered with wire mesh and housed around 10 to 15 people. Some sat chatting in a corner, while others walked around, stretching their legs. It was a usual yard time. Suddenly, something happened on the other side. I went there immediately. Someone had fallen to the ground. I squatted and lifted him into my arms, trying to understand what had happened. My arm, he said, my left arm. He was having a heart attack. We called a guard, and they came and took him. They first took him to the prison infirmary, and the doctor referred him to the hospital. A few days passed. He returned. As he entered the cell, our eyes met. He went to his bed, still not talking to anyone. I couldn't resist. I went to him. "How are you?" I asked. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied. "What happened?" I inquired, intentionally prolonging the conversation to alleviate boredom and understand his story. "It was a heart attack," he said. "You saved me," he added. For the first time in a long time, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "No," I said, "the doctor saved you. All I did was call the guard." He nodded as if to acknowledge that. He looked a bit pale. Wanting him to rest, I returned to my place, but couldn't help glancing at him occasionally. The next morning, after the roll call, I went for breakfast. This time, he came too. After exchanging greetings, I asked about his night and whether he felt any pain. He said he was fine. This wasn't the first time it happened. I learned that he had experienced it years ago. After breakfast, we went to our respective workplaces. I worked in the carpentry section, and he was in the library. He liked being there and said, "I feel like I'm somewhere else when I'm there." I always enjoyed working with wood, and it helped me earn some money. After lunch, we were back in the yard. This time, I went to him again. This time, I directly asked him, why? He began to tell his story. "It was many years ago," he said, during our university years. We were studying in a small town, but our dreams were big. We wanted to become useful people for our country, start our own business, earn our own money, find a beautiful girl, and live a family life. At least, that's what we thought. However, life insisted on implementing its own plan. In the third year, I met a girl who had just started the first year. If you could see her, she was like the moon. An absolute beauty with her fair skin, pitch black, long, wavy hair that captivated me. Slim fingers, a height reaching up to my chin, and a delicate waist that seemed like it could break when hugged. I feel her in the deepest part of my heart. However, there was someone else who had his eyes on her, and that someone happened to be my roommate, a scoundrel. He had even told me about it. If he hadn't, I would have let her go. It was not in our code to be with a friend's girlfriend. While recounting these events, he seemed to relive those moments. Especially when talking about her, it was as if that love was still lingering somewhere in the depths of his soul. He continued, days went by with studies and entertainment. One night, while having fun with friends at a venue, 3 people confronted me outside, one holding a knife, pointed directly at my stomach. "What did you say?" I asked, filled with excitement. "What could I say?" he replied. Apparently, I appeared too confident, too free, and seemed too close to girls. What he meant by closeness was dancing together. It wasn't anything more. It was just youth. "Don't overstep your boundaries," I said to them. "Just so you know, this won't end well for you next time," I added, thinking there would be a next time. They left, saying, "This won't end like this next time," as if implying it wouldn't end well for me. After that day, a kind of coldness settled in my approach to life. I wouldn't call it cowardice, but I started thinking, why should I invite trouble upon myself? I reduced my visits to social places and focused on my studies. I let go of the girl, and she got together with someone else. Days passed, however. A few months later, a dispute erupted at home, and the conversation turned to that night. My future roommate, the scoundrel, said, "I sent them to you that night." Out of nowhere, this snake, who I had nurtured in my bosom, turned out to be the one who had set me up. I understood it at that moment, but too much time had passed since the incident. I didn't dwell on it. I was planning to take his life, but until then, I had only held a weapon in the military. I neither knew how to hold a gun nor how to use it. So, I decided to find a shooting range first and practice. I found a recently opened shooting range nearby, and started going there on specific days. To those who asked, I simply said, "I've taken an interest in hunting." After a while, my confidence grew. I was sure I could hit the target. I researched types of guns, looking for a light, agile weapon that wouldn't be cumbersome. I found what I was looking for in Konya. I talked to the guy, made a deal, and got the gun. Now, all that was left was to end the case that had been eating away at me for years, but I never thought about this bastard's call as necessary to realize that. In the meantime, while I was doing all these shooting range and gun-related things, I continued to meet with him, but I did my best not to reveal any openings. I was doing everything in my power not to show any weakness, to protect myself from what was happening. While I was doing the shooting range and gun stuff, I continued to talk to him occasionally, but I was doing my best not to reveal any openings. I had convinced myself that putting an end to this scumbag's life was the only way to extinguish the fire inside me and to achieve peace of mind. Anyway, as we were saying, I got the gun, continued going to the shooting range for a while. One day, I called the scumbag and told him that I had a job interview in the city where he lived and that I wanted to visit him if it was convenient. Of course, he accepted. It would be a joyous reunion of 2 housemates who hadn't seen each other for years. When I arrived there, I told him I would call him. And the day came. I hadn't slept that night, turning the plan over in my head, and laughing to myself at how happy I would be when I took his life. At the agreed upon time, he came to the hotel where I was staying. I told him I would call him when I was ready. And that day arrived. I hadn't slept the night before, contemplating the plan and laughing to myself about how happy I would be when I took his life. Just as we had planned, I called him, and he came up to my room. And that day arrived. I hadn't slept the night before, contemplating the plan and laughing to myself about how happy I would be when I took his life. Just as we had planned, I called him, and he came up to my room. When he came to the hotel, the receptionist said, "It's for 2 people, sir." At that moment, I felt a shock. My plan was not like this. Of course, I didn't say anything to the girl. I just said, "Okay, let them come." A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Although not all hotels have it, there was a peephole in the door of the hotel I was staying in. I looked through it. This scumbag was there, and there was also a girl, no more than 12 years old, with him. At that moment, I realized that I didn't have time to change the plan. The arrow had already left the bow. When a person locks onto a target, they want to achieve it at all costs, and after a certain point, they don't think about the cost or consequence. I was in that situation. Because once you believe that extinguishing the fire inside you is only possible in this way, you devote your time, effort, and money to this cause. More importantly, there was an account to settle from years ago, something that needed to be seen. I was thinking that way at that moment, just as I still do now. Anyway, I thought we should meet before he saw the plan and tried to defend himself. I had been preparing for this moment for days, having planned it in my mind. I had spent the time, effort, and money that I should have spent on other things on this. More importantly, there was an account to settle from years ago, something that needed to be seen. I thought that way at that moment, just as I still do now. Anyway, while he was telling his story, my mood was starting to change. He was telling it so sincerely and excitedly, as if I was living it one-to-one, handling the gun in the shooting range, talking to that man on the phone, and counting the days to settle the accounts of the past. Just like me. In the meantime, the ventilation had ended. The guard's inside voice signaled that our conversation had to end here. But my insides were burning. I wanted to know the outcome. I told him this, and he asked me not to worry and to come to him in the evening. After that, we both returned to our daily routine. I couldn't see him at dinner. Actually, I was a bit late. Our prison prosecutor had requested a special piece. I had dealt with him, delivered a good job, and handed it over to him. He had informed the guards to reserve the meal. When I went, there were already a couple of people there. I ate my meal. After taking a shower, I was sent back to the ward. When I entered the ward, my friends told me what had happened. He had fallen into his workshop in the afternoon. The guards took him away. The prison doctor also requested him to be taken to the hospital. He was there, under observation, for a couple of days. A few days passed. The guard told me I had a visitor. I was one of those without anyone, and frankly, I was curious about who was coming. A woman in her 30s came. I thought she was a lawyer at first. She wasn't. She was the daughter of that scumbag my friend had talked about. I asked her why she came. She said, "Why do you think?" I recounted one by one what my friend had told me about her father's actions. I explained that this situation had instilled in me a sense of unfinished business, a desire to finish what had been started when I saw her father. I asked her why she came. I wanted him not to go, she said. Tell me what happened that day, I asked, with a curious attitude, wanting to know the end of the story. On that day, she said, we actually had someone else with us. My mother was there too. So we were 3, not 2. When we entered, my father's friend's hands were tied behind his back. He looked weird, sweating, and in a bit of a strange state. When my father was about to shake hands, I saw the gun in his hand. She paused. I could hear her trying to get the words out, struggling but unable to continue. After a while, she gathered herself and continued. I shouted, "Dad." He said, "You're already dead." That guy was like a raging bull, eyes bulging, face all red. I could feel that he was in pain, too, but my anger and rage were certainly greater. What happened next? I asked. Tears started rolling down her eyes all of a sudden. My father and I entered first, she said. But the door was open, because my mother was coming from behind. When we entered, my father's friend's hands were tied behind his back. He looked weird, sweating, and in a bit of a strange state. When my father was about to shake hands, I saw the gun in his hand. She paused. I could hear her trying to get the words out, struggling but unable to continue. After a while, she gathered herself and continued. I shouted, "Dad." He said, "You're already dead." That guy was like a raging bull, eyes bulging, face all red. I could feel that he was in pain, too, but my anger and rage were certainly greater. What happened next? I asked. Tears started rolling down her eyes all of a sudden. Inside, I had to be brave and put on a mask of strength, she continued. But deep down, I felt helpless. The gun was still pointed at us, but he couldn't pull the trigger. My mother ran to my father, and I tried to hide behind her. The gun went off at that moment. My mother got shot in the forehead. She collapsed right there. The guy still had the gun, but he couldn't shoot at us, she said. The police came within a minute or two. They took him, dragged him away. He said nothing else. That was his last words. She fell silent after that sentence. I fell silent too. She was trying to wipe away her tears with the tissue in her hand. She continued after a while. Police arrived within a minute or two. They took him, dragged him away. He said nothing else. That was his last words. After that sentence, she fell silent. I fell silent too. She was trying to wipe away her tears with the tissue in her hand. She continued after a while. 3 days later, a news spread. A woman in her 30s, with poison concealed inside, killed her father's murderer with a single injection smuggled into prison.